podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Christiana Zenner. Christiana, thanks for being here.
It's a joy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Sam.
Yeah, I'm really grateful that you made some time for us and excited to chat with you about your work. And for folks who don't know you already, a little brief bio is in order. You're Associate Professor of Theology, Science, and Ethics in the Department of Theology at Fordham University, and author of a wonderful book, Just Water, Theology, Ethics, and Global Fresh Water Crises, which is in its second edition as of 2018. So I've got some books out and nobody asked me for a second edition. That's a special achievement.
You
And
have some great books out, and they each bear rereading, Sam.
well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm just fishing for compliments. So yeah, your research into freshwater ethics intersects with ecological theory, religious ecologies, earth sciences, and the ecological turn in Catholic social teaching. So excited to chat with you about all that, especially the book's only becoming more relevant as time goes on. Freshwater crises are not getting better really anytime soon. Not to alarm people, but it's quite alarming. So before we get into that, I'm always curious to hear people's kind of origin story. How did you get into this work? Especially people who do like ecological theology or religion and ecology. You're bridging worlds that are often seen as pretty separate. You know, the world of science and the world of religion. If you care about freshwater, get into science, get into policy, get into activism. Why religion, right? And so how did you get into this kind of work where religion and ecology intersect for you?
Thanks for asking. It's always fun to figure out which autobiographical version to introduce in a given setting. And in this one, I'm coming off of the first week of teaching. In this case, I was teaching my class Anthropocenes, Sciences, Fictions, and Ethical Values.
Mm,
And so, an aphoristic way to describe it is that science, religious, cultural value systems, political economy, and legal frameworks, these are all ways of striving to understand, discern, and articulate normative stances towards the reality that humans inhabit. And I began my undergraduate career as a chemistry major,
mm,
became a human biology major, realized I wasn't going to go to medical school and I didn't want to spend a ton of time in a lab, but that I was fascinated by the bioethics quandaries that were emerging at the time. This was 2000, 2001, roughly. And so questions of the Human Genome Project, questions about stem cell research, end of life care, palliative care, these were all sorting in new ways in some ways because of technologies. And so I became really interested in science, technology, and society, as well as philosophy of science. And then was thinking about the practical dimensions by which people, myself included, make decisions. And as much love and respect as I have for analytic philosophy and analytic philosophers, it is generally not the case that philosophical ethical paradigms or moral philosophy are what guide people's decision making on matters ecological or bioethical. And so what I started realizing is in the places to begin to get at these questions, we have anthropological methods within the Euro-American Western academies, and we have religious studies. And so I, through a series of events at the intersection of the personal and professional, ended up at Yale, working at Yale's Bioethics Center for several years. And I was an undergrad at Stanford, and I had worked at Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics for a few years as well as a research assistant. And so translating that to the East Coast context, I had the privilege of being exposed to a lot of scientific departments as well as social sciences and humanities. And really, if you'll forgive the metaphor, tried on these different cloaks of methodologies and approaches and questions. And I found that I was fascinated by the depth and history of religious moral frameworks,
mm,
not only in terms of certain stated commitments. For example, with regard to bioethics, it might be the all life has dignity in a Catholic formulation and how that is parsed out with regard to reproductive rights or lack thereof. or end of life care looks one way. How it looks in other religious traditions will be different. And so I ended up applying to do a PhD in religious ethics after doing a master's in ethics at Yale Divinity School. And I'm going to be real honest. I was not loving my PhD coursework
Hmm.
my second year in the program. And I was trying to figure out why this was. Because I think every doctoral student, at the risk of generalization, faces the quandary of how do I relate the history and canon of what needs to be learned to prove oneself in the guild
Right.
to the emerging questions and realities
Right.
that confront us and the methods that are often cutting edge. And that, this is so salient for religion and ecology, for environmental studies, for bioethics, for lots of things. So I did what any graduate student might do, which is I dyed my hair pink, and it was actually pink stripes, and was really doing this set of questions of why am I not jiving with this? And I essentially had this epiphany as I was going through things I love versus things that drive me crazy, and or make me feel very bored inside. And I had this realization of, wait, I read and think about freshwater, especially freshwater in the Central Valley of California, especially aridity in the West. I think about it all the time. And to me, the values of freshwater are that they're essential, they are life-giving, there are, this is a substance to be valued, and it is in certain ways in the Central Valley of California, especially. But that was not obvious to people on the East Coast. And I'd spent so much time trying to explain this to people on the East Coast. And then I finally realized, Zenner, you can write a dissertation on values for freshwater, cultural, religious, economic, and how different moral paradigms conduce to certain kinds of ends, whether that's profit or human flourishing or what have you. So that's a long story about the semi-circuitous route I took. Edited a volume in bioethics, edited a volume in sustainability, and then landed at Fordham and wrote this book for maximal legibility with Catholic social teaching and other disciplines.
Nice. Yeah, it really is remarkable how much fresh water is so obviously necessary for life, and we wouldn't be here without it. And yet, so easy to background, and so many people just like kind of ignore it. And as long as the tap is running and things like that, then you just don't think about it. So yeah, I appreciate that, especially that I think that's good advice for anybody doing this kind of work is find the thing that you think about all the time and that kind of is just like you can't stop thinking about it, you can't get your mind off of it. It's like that's a good sign that maybe you should focus on that and research that, write about that. So yeah, otherwise I don't know what people are doing in the academy. And they're just, I guess, you find maybe a gap in the literature and you focus on that or something. But I'm like, I think, you want to follow your passion to some extent. They'll keep you more motivated anyway. Otherwise,
Yeah.
burnout seems pretty likely.
Agreed. And, as I tell my students, often at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level with regard to discernment of dissertation topics, there are several ways that you can know there's an energy behind a topic for you. One is that you love it, and as you said, you're drawn to it, you keep thinking about it, perhaps obsessively, perhaps occasionally, but it's always there in some way. Another way is that you have a very strong frustration response to it and sense this is something that needs to be addressed because it really pisses me off. And that is also a type of information. And, both are worth following. And in neither case does it ensure that an entire career or series of 5 books will be written on a given topic, but it's the direction that the world is opening for you to follow now. So if it's possible, follow it.
No, I like that. Yeah. I've definitely done some projects that are like that where I'm just really angry about something. I'm just like, all right, somebody needs to say something about this because it's extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
on that note, one of the things I've been trying to do, we've had this podcast going for a few years, and I've tried to add some more structure to it along the way. And one of the things I've been trying to add lately is a segment that I'd like to call "What's Bothering You." And in that case, I'm curious, what's one of those things that's really angering you right now? And that could be, an issue in the world, some kind of political issue, an economic thing. It could be about the way we treat freshwater or the
Mhm.
Anthropocene, or it could be something more about the field, something that's upsetting you about religion, ecology, or ecological theology, or Catholic social teaching, any of that. So what's a thing that's upsetting you? And I think one of the reasons I like to ask people this also is I feel like anger is good, like clickbait, and it's very having people kind of spout off about stuff. That's, otherwise we just have friendly conversations, and that's not good for getting more viewers and listeners. So the anger is, that's a popular way to attract people. And I think it's just good for us to kind of air our grievances. So yeah, what's
Agreed.
something that's
Yeah.
bothering you?
Well, they indicate growing edges, I think. And also, it is funny to hear professors rant
Yeah,
about this.
exactly.
I grant this, but I actually, if you don't mind, I want to give a shout out to many womanist and Black feminist scholars who have written so well and so adroitly for, in some cases, a really long time about the relationship of anger to ethical action
Mm,
and what it is to write and work from that space and how to do so in a system that is structured against certain kinds of bodies, certain kinds of insights.
yeah.
And so I think that is a really important and transformative type of wisdom about anger that I just want to lift up here because so many poets, Nikki Finney, one of my personal heroes, Polly Murray, late civil rights activist and now transgender icon, have navigated and explored that tension. And to acknowledge and metabolize the anger and draw on it as fuel without being consumed or without capitulating to the structures that occlude certain kinds of insights or flourishing is so important.
Yeah.
So shout out to some of my faves.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, what's bothering me? Let's see. I'm going to go really proximately. And this is germane to the conversation about freshwater. Currently, as we're recording this, it's September 7th, 2023. This weekend, the New York Times launched a big feature on aquifer depletion. And as many folks know from reading the news, and many more know from scholarly expertise, aquifers are types of essentially natural storage containers and systems for groundwater that can be, the water in them can be 10 months old, 10 years old, or a million years old. And aquifers are an essential part of our freshwater cycling systems in many parts of the world. They don't look the same. They're not generalizable, but they have provided in many, many parts of the world the water resources for agricultural growth, manufacturing growth, and domestic/population growth. The problem is that, as you may infer, when aquifers are 100, 1,000, 10,000, or a million years old, once they are pumped, water folks refer to this as being mined, mining water functionally, because it's a non-renewable resource in this sense. The water doesn't go back in. Okay, aquifers. Important, have been writing about them for a long time. And a huge, back to the Central Valley, huge issue in California's Central Valley, which I realized I forgot to say is where I was born. So that kind of originary consciousness of the way that space, place, and culture impact one is exhibit A.
Right.
But so I'm reading through this aquifers thing, getting excited, and then I just got frustrated. Not because it was wrong, it was right in many respects, but I was frustrated for at least two reasons. The first is that it was presented as if this was a discovery that the journalists had made. I understand headlines, clickbait, all of these things matter for journalism in the present moment. But this culture of X entity has discovered Y reality, and this is why you should read it, is as problematic in journalism as it is in academia.
Yeah.
And in both cases, we build on work done by predecessors, done by collaborations between institutions, often research institutions, sometimes governmental ones. And this leads me to the second and third problems, which are there were so few scholars cited in that article. Some were interviewed. And I understand that with journalism, you have character limits, word count limits. But when you're building on data sets that have been generated in the context of university and government collaborations and so forth, I feel like you owe a bibliography.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was disheartened to see that some really amazing people who've been working on this stuff for decades were not cited. Manny Teodoro in Texas, Jay Famiglietti, formerly at UC Davis, now at Arizona State University, folks whose work is deeply linked to the data generating mechanisms that the New York Times drew upon, but who appear nowhere in the article. And then that links to the third part, which is about this data analytics moment that we live in, and to some degree links to generative AI as well. What does it mean when data can be produced by various mechanisms and then mined and assembled, but without reference or recognition to how that was done, the parameters that were entered, the systems that paid for it to be set up? What happens to transparency and integrity when all of that falls away? And then the emphasis is on, we found this data. Side note, we don't question the data, we just do things with it. And then we generated this new result. So it opened a whole huge can of bothers for me, as you can see. That's really the big one. Yeah.
No, that's a good one. No, I get that very much. And there's so many contexts where that happens, and somebody's like, "Oh, look what I found." And it's like, there's all these people doing all this work, and you're just, kind of coming in and stumbling over all of it. And that's really, not only is it just unfair to all the people doing all this great work, but it's also preventing us from kind of building the kind of connections and alliances that are going to be grounds for effective action.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so what was, what were they saying overall? Was there any kind of like, here's how we should move forward in relationship to aquifers? Or was it just like, hey, look at this interesting data we just learned about aquifers?
Well, it was more towards the latter. There were some indications that this is a reality. It was very US focused, which is fine. It's the New York Times. I live and teach in New York, so it's my local hometown newspaper. Kidding, but maybe I'm allowed to be super cranky about it as a result. There were not many indicators of what folks are doing in order to try to ameliorate the problem. And there were not many diagnoses specific to certain causes of it, except in a general sense. So, for example, there were mentions of agriculture, and I would say in particular in the United States, going further than the article did, the need to talk about monocultures and the growing of very thirsty crops in very arid landscapes. So the thing about crop to climate alignment was not really developed in there as it could have been. Thinking about the ways in which agriculture functions and is subsidized in the United States. The food bill, the farm bill is coming up before Congress again. The perennial lobbies and ways that certain products are encouraged for growth in a largely corporate agriculture context is really problematic. Questions of water pollution. The New York Times did note one of the problems that pertains to rampant real estate expansion and growth in arid areas. But and that is an issue, right? It's been an issue in Arizona, the Times and many others have covered it. But when you really look at it, the biggest users of water and aquifer collapse causes, which result in ground subsidence and so forth, often have to do with major source withdrawals that are generally more tied to agriculture, sometimes tourism, sometimes industry, than they are to individual domestic uses. And yet, it's almost always individuals and their families who bear the brunt of the scarcity or the pollution, the contamination and toxic body loads that result. So it's interesting because what I think historically has been seen as an environmental ethics issue or a water rights legal issue is very much presenting itself now as an embodied human bioethical issue. And this is something I've been trying to point out in various literatures for a while, but it's really only been since 2016 with Flint, with Standing Rock,
Mhm.
that I think this has begun to turn into public consciousness in a different way. So,
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, it's really crazy to think that was just 2016.
yep.
Because I know I've got a lot of students who that was something that kind of woke them up, and they're
Mhm.
like, "Oh, right, Flint. Okay, water is an issue." And it's
Mhm.
not just something that's up to individual behavior. There's larger systems
Yeah.
at work that we need to address. Otherwise, I have known very serious scholars, and they're very committed to environmental issues, and they think I'm going to start taking shorter showers. And that's kind of the limit of their concern, and just like, okay, I'll be really careful with how much water I give my house plants and things like that. And okay, that's
Mhm.
nice. But even if we all stopped showering entirely, that wouldn't solve these other issues of how agriculture and industry are using our water supplies.
Exactly. And I'm so glad you brought that example of both the students and their consciousness, and then well-intended folks trying to take shorter showers as a way of intervening. And I'm thankful about that on a couple levels. One, back in 2014, I did a series of educational videos for TED Ed, right when they were beginning their animated educational shorts. And it was about, where does our water come from and why is scarcity a problem? And then questions of emerging freshwater ethics and what should we do about this. And the things that, in pithy form, accessible to like eighth graders as well as 92-year-olds, and everyone in between, the thing that I talk about in both of those videos is precisely this mismatch between freshwater consumption, which in water language, consumption has a very particular meaning. It means water that is removed from a particular watershed or source and is not able to go back into the watershed in any meaningful way. So any water that is transformed, say, into a crop, or that is polluted in a non reparative way, those are consumptive uses of fresh water. Okay, as far as consumptive uses of fresh water go, the big consumer is agriculture, which makes sense because you need water to turn seeds into suppers. And then manufacturing. So agriculture is about 70%, manufacturing and industry, and this includes cooling for energy systems and so forth. That's about 22%. And if you do the math, that leaves about 8% that is consumed by domestic uses. So those of us well-intentioned who turn off the tap when they brush their teeth or try to take shorter showers, I'm not always good at that. I really love a good shower. Um, Here's what I say to that. It matters because it cultivates a habit of attention. And that habit of attention can be a form of mindfulness, can help develop not only a stance of virtue, because in traditional Western philosophy, virtues tend to be good or praiseworthy habits, and vices tend to be bad ones. But also, as I like to think of it in a more expansive way, because paying attention to water and our embodied relationship to it opens apertures for us to see where water shows up in our lives and where it's invisibilized. And I think a lot of the work around water or around other kinds of environmental goods, environmental entities, is making visible the connections that have been rendered invisible either by abundance or ease or by politic economic intent or fiat. And so the last thing I'll say on that is that this obsession slash attempt to do better individually, I do maintain that it's important, but it's also a fiat that is linked to corporate America's, especially beverage companies and others, oil and gas industry as well, attempt to argue that the responsibility for environmental degradation, recycling, wise use, limitation of fossil fuels, all of that falls on the individual. So when you privatize an individualized moral responsibility, it focuses it on us. It doesn't focus it on the system structures or large scale offenders.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like, because of course it's like, well, hey, it's not just an individual issue, there's larger systems. But as an individual, it is still good to practice some kind of mindful relationship to water. And so if you're brushing your
Yeah.
teeth and the water's going, you think, wait a second, let me shut that off. And like
Yeah.
that's obviously not having any statistically significant impact on the world's freshwater supply, but it is helping you cultivate this virtuous kind of attention to water.
Yeah.
And then you start thinking, well, where else is water in my life? And you think of
Exactly.
like, oh, right, I'm using a computer right now. There's water that goes into the manufacturing of computers and like microchips. And so you start to think about where else is it, and what else might I be able to do? Where's some other points of leverage that I might have in my life to make some larger change? So yeah, I appreciate that. And at the same time, if you need to take a couple extra minutes in the shower for some self-care, then go for it. Because we need to care for ourselves, and there's there's a point at which this kind of environmental asceticism, I guess you'd say,
Hmm.
might be doing more harm than good.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's helpful to think of that as a practice of virtue. It's like it's easy to
Yeah.
go too much with it. It's easy to go too little with it. We're just trying to hit that golden mean.
That golden mean.
Yeah.
And, as I tell, especially when I'm giving talks in institutions other than my own or various settings, um, where people are hearing me preach for the first time on ways to think about water. Obviously, I use that term tongue in cheek. Um, the habits of what we pay attention to can show up in so many different ways. And interestingly, Sam, this circles back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. Notice what it is you pay attention to, and then also cultivate to some degree what it is you pay attention to. And I say to students a lot of times, especially when they're feeling beleaguered or psychologically exhausted or have various sorts of anxiety about, very reasonably, climate change realities, planetary changes, local degradations, etc. If you're concerned about these things, in my case, for example, I often use fresh water, start where you are and start with who you are. Students who are studying economics, there's so much important work to be done in the valuation of fresh water on ecological economic paradigms and a range of other, including feminist economic paradigms, as opposed to the historical, more neoliberal extractive paradigms. If you're a lawyer, same thing about water rights. What kind of thing is water? Is it a commodity, a property right, a public good, a trust? I mean, so much is possible, and these things are not given. And so finding a way to enter them, whether it's through one's undergraduate education or awareness of the levers, as you said, that one can press in one's already existing career, is a way forward.
Yeah, I think that's always helpful to point out because it's so overwhelming when you think of the
Yes.
scale and scope of these kind of issues. You're like, well, where am I supposed to start? You're like, well, start
Yeah.
where you are, and that's enough. And if everybody was doing that just a little bit, that would really scale up into some really effective action. So yeah, we don't need to just take the issue en masse and fix it, but find it in your own life. And everybody
Yeah.
has some connection to it. It's such, especially climate change can be such an abstract issue, but something like water is so palpable. It's such a part of
Mhm.
our everyday lives. I think it's easier for people to find ways to care about it.
I agree because we relate to it directly. And actually with climate change, I say something similar because, climate change is, I think, a great example of what ecological theorist Timothy Morton regards as a hyper object. It's determinative, it's omnipresent in certain ways, but it's very difficult to touch. So maybe a little bit like the internet, we can get into the into the philosophical concept another time. So how do you bring something like climate change into tangibility in a way that is useful and empowering to people? For me, it's through water. And luckily there are all these great quotes available that I engage in my book. One is by Travis Huxman, who headed the Biosphere 2 project at University of Arizona for a while, and now I believe is at UC Irvine, who says water is the hammer with which climate change will hit the earth. Or Zafar Adil, who was one of the first heads of UN Water, said climate change is all about water. So no matter where you are in the world, the interactions between climate change and freshwater, water impacts in general, but freshwater impacts in particular, are very, very specific and very, very acute. And there are some generalizable patterns that can be drawn from those, but also there are really regionally specific upshots.
You know, one of the things you hear from the climate dismissives, climate deniers, so they're like it's fine. There's so much water on the planet, and you
Mhm.
know it's largely salt water, but we can just take the salt out, and everything's fine. So stop your worrying. There's plenty of water to go around. So I wonder what's your response to that? It because it seems like this crazy kind of techno utopian fantasy, and not feasible for a variety of reasons. So I wonder if you could talk to that issue, which I'm sorry to bring up, but it's one of those things that is raised so much.
So
And
often, and I would
yeah,
imagine, especially in California,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Carmel, San Diego, you know, all these places have
yeah.
been
There's
very,
look at the Pacific Ocean. It's
yeah,
massive. We're gonna be fine.
yeah. And, you know, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It is a technological problematic that sometimes people love to put forward as the solution to freshwater crises. And so let's unpack all of that for a minute. Obviously, as you said, salt water is salt water. So in order to make it potable and useful for humans in a variety of ways, manufacturing, agriculture, domestic uses, it needs to be desalinated. And there is, as you and many listeners well know, a particularly enthusiastic subset of environmental, technological, economic advocates who often fall under the umbrella term ecomodernists, who think that through a combination of the right political economic paradigms and pricing mechanisms, along with the right silver bullet kinds of technologies, a certain kind of synchronicity, excuse me, can be achieved by which these complicated environmental and increasingly bioethical problems can be ameliorated, if not solved, once and for all. So if you want a great example of this, go to the Breakthrough Institute's website in the 2015 Eco-Modernist Manifesto. And this is something that's germane not just to fresh water or questions of agriculture and so forth. It's also very much, and perhaps in even more and different robust ways, spoken about in terms of notions of the Anthropocene and geoengineering, and even folks, you know, now moving out a level to minerals extraction and question of interplanetary exploration, asteroid mining, um, SpaceX, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot there, but let's just stick to the desal question. Um, yes, I mean, technology, awesome. I'm pro technology, earbuds, computer. My life is dependent on it, right? And I am a creature of my time and place and culture. And I can no more imagine, well, I guess I can imagine it, but I don't want to live without these kind of amenities. And I would like it if many other people in the world, in fact, the majority of the world, were able to have the same kinds of amenities as I do. So we'll put the question of consumption slightly to the side for a minute, but I just want to flag that this is a biggie there. Desalination has been a really important technology in so many parts of the world. Saudi Arabia, Israel post 1948, a range of other places, some attempts in Southern California, and so forth. And it will only become more important as these questions of aridification and aquifer depletion continue to amplify. Fine. You know, but technologies are only as good as the ethical frameworks, the political frameworks within which they are deployed. They are never a panacea. They are never a silver bullet. And that's because it's humans, generally right now, until AI takes over, it's humans who are making those ethical paradigms and deciding on the uses. And they're deciding on who gets the water for what ends. They're deciding on, you know, when you desalinate and there are toxic brine salts that result from it. It's humans who are deciding where those go. It's humans who are deciding what the economic and environmental and social impacts of those are. So, point one, any technology, including desal, is only as good as the framework and context within which it is deployed. And that is why I'm a big advocate of, all of our technologies, whether it's generative AI or desalination, need ethical frameworks that attend to very fundamental human and ecosystemic goods. But then there's this other thing of like, desalination is not a perfect technology, and it will continue to improve because technologies do. But do we really want to live in a world and a society where we consume all of the pre-existing vital resources, lay waste to the earth, and say no big deal because we can just do the same thing to the oceans? So it'll be fine.
Right.
Now, obviously, I'm making that a little bit of an extreme, possibly a reductio ad absurdum case. But it's that mentality that is extractive, that is growth without replacement, that treats the ecological entities that support the common good, that support the diversity of life on this planet, it treats them as instrumental to the ends of profit or certain social forms. And so again, the problem is not only a technical one, it's a human and ethical one.
That's good. I appreciate that. Because I'll generally just say, stop it with your love of desal plants. Like, no. How
Yeah.
about just no? And yeah, a few places where it's effective and important, okay, but we shouldn't even try to improve that technology. Let's just not do that. I tend to veer toward the Luddite side of things a lot. Just can we just not? And some technology I like, but I'm like, wouldn't it just be better if we were living like we were like 20,000 years ago? That was nice. And like, no, of course not. So it's important to make concessions
Mhm.
to the way it's like, well, in the right ethical context with the right frameworks, these things can work and they can help us out. And especially because of climate change, we're going to need to use some of these technologies to some extent. So that's a helpful concession, I think. Otherwise, the battles with ecomodernists just become these kind of intractable debates, and it's just like, all right, this is
Yeah.
going nowhere. And you kind of have the degrowthers on the one side, and the ecomodernists on the other side, and they're just
Yep.
banging their heads together forever. So I appreciate the nuance there. That's very helpful,
Well,
helpful
I'm
for me
glad.
personally. Well, I wonder, thinking of all the things that are upsetting about fresh water and just about the state of the world, I'm also curious, what's something that excites you or makes you feel
Mm.
hopeful, or any number of other things, courageous? I don't know, but what's some good news? And I hear
Ooh,
especially,
yay.
people suffer so much increasingly from things like eco anxiety and grief, and it's it's important to know that it's not all bad out there. There's some good things happening, and it's a weird situation when things are getting better and worse kind of at the same time. But good to know that things are getting better in some way. And so, what's something that's kind of exciting you or making you hopeful? And that could be the smallest thing. You'd be like, "Well, my garden is doing well," or whatever it is. The smallest thing, the biggest thing. What's something that's making you feel good these days?
Aw, thanks. That's a good question. I mean, I do love my garden, and we can come back to that. The Californian in me never wants to give up on Meyer lemons and
Uh,
star jasmine. They have to live inside during the winter, obviously. And I just have a little tiny balcony. But I really vacillate between a deep and abiding love for humans and occasional misanthropy.
hmm.
Um, and all of that, that says as much about me as it does about anyone else and their actual conduct and way of being in the world. But I will say that there are so many humans striving to learn and be thoughtful and do good things and inspire one another and reflect in mediums from the scholarly to the creative, to the pop culture facing. And while that can often be overlooked in moments of doom and gloom, and the intensity of various reports, whether it's from the IPCC or a report on aquifers or what have you, there are so many people doing such good work in so many places. And the internet is awesome because it allows people to connect, not just like in the conversation we're having today, but in terms of activism, in terms of resource sharing, and many other modes. And I know this seems obvious, but sometimes it's really useful to dwell on what's taken for granted as being a datum. Because you look back to even like 1999, 2000, when big water riots and conflicts over fresh water were going on in Cochabamba, Bolivia, for example. One of the reasons that became such a big deal is it was right on the cusp of the opening of internet to many different populations. And so news traveled fast in such a way that previously could not happen. Similarly, too, that while the ongoing murders of environmental justice activists in many parts of the world, and especially the global South, and especially in certain ways, Latin and South America, while that is horrible, it is also really important that there are platforms by which we can learn, teach, carry on lessons and memories, and try to push back against those kinds of things. So I think not only is there possibility for connection, there's also transparency and hopefully eventually forms of accountability that are just so different in this day and age from when I was growing up, until I was like 13, 14, 15. I think I got my first Juno.com account when I was like 16. Netscape, dial-up modem. But it's like, that gives me a lot of hope. And I also love the generations that have come up since me and mine. I'm sort of that cusp generation. And I know that millennials and now subsequent generations get a lot of flack sometimes for, being irresponsible or, being flaky or whatnot. But honestly, a lot of folks are really awesome. Like, I think that's just a datum of humanity. Like, some of us are awesome and motivated and others of us are freeloaders. Okay, hello, welcome to humanity. And so I don't want to do that thing where I put the burden of getting us out of this mess onto the younger generation because they're energetic and awesome. But because I'm a teacher and because I get to be in the classroom, I do see a lot of ways that this generation is energetic and awesome. And it gives me hope, especially when I've been like thinking about freshwater crises for almost 20 years.
Yeah. That's good. Those are a couple of good ones. Like the more easily accessible information because of the internet. And so like people can organize like never before.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much kind of like the fourth wave of feminism, right? They're like after the third wave, now there's
Totally.
a new wave. And it's like, well, what happens when all the women of the world can communicate quickly? Like,
Yeah.
well, then a lot of change can happen. And especially the fact that the youth are so energetic about it. And they have so much more to lose because they have to live on what's increasingly an uninhabitable Earth, and so they're very motivated. And but yeah, and it is one of those things. So like, I'm not saying you young people do it by yourselves because there is sometimes you hear that. Luckily, the young people will fix it anyway. I'm just going to go back to not caring.
Yeah, exactly. It's not an excuse for those of us who've been stomping around on this planet longer to just say, "Oh well, your problem, not mine."
Yeah, good luck with that one, kids.
And I also, I think, I don't know, this is so much a hope as an entrenched problem that I'm happy that people are seeing as a problem, which is certain paradigms of profit-oriented extractive growth, So like on the spectrum of ecomodernism to degrowth, what ecological economics and degrowthers point out as so essential is, wait a minute, what are our economic paradigms based on except a totally consumptive model of the very foundations of planetary well-being? And so having written a book on such things, the planetarity, you are no stranger to this kind of thought. But I love that there are students who are willing to question the premises in a consistent way. And so that's exciting. Maybe that's the best way to aphorize it, is folks who are willing to question the premises and try to do something about it from where they are.
Yeah, right. Like even when it comes to something like transitioning toward renewable energy, you're like, well,
Hmm.
wait a second. If we're still basing this on the same extractivism that we're using for fossil fuels, it's not
Hmm.
actually going to solve any problems at all. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, people are kind of seeing through those basic premises, and it's like we can't just take the same attitude toward renewables that we took toward fossil
Right.
fuel. That's going to just create so much havoc around the planet. It'll make some people a lot of money, but ultimately it's not going to be good for society or for the
Yeah.
ecosystems of Earth. And so, yeah, I'm increasingly very heartened by that, and people are seeing through those premises.
Hmm.
Um, all right, well, one last thing, it's always fun to chat about is what's next, what's happening. You know, what's the future looking like for you? You got any projects in the works right now, or you're teaching things like that?
Oh, always multiple things going on. I actually can't juggle three things IRL with my hands, but boy, do I juggle the projects and the ideas. I've never actually put those two things in juxtaposition together. Maybe my inability to do this one is linked to my ability to do this one.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but also that, I mean, correlation does not imply causation. So there's that. Um, okay. Well, I'm teaching my Anthropocene class this semester, and I'm currently director of undergraduate education for my department at the Fordham College Lincoln Center campus where I am. So that has been really interesting to work a ton with undergrads and work theology and religious studies along with their different courses of study, which has been a really, I mean, I'm deeply interdisciplinary, as you know. So for me, that's been an interesting and lovely thing, even as my fit in a theology department straight up is I'm a little quirky for that. It's a little questionable. Different conversation. Um, but I am working on three book projects at present, one of which will be done by March, one of which I hope to have done by the end of 2024, and one of which I have aim to have done by the end of 2025. So the first one is called Beyond Laudato Si, and it is reflecting on essentially what will have been 10 years since the release of Pope Francis's ecology encyclical, Laudato Si, and identifying places based on ecological theory, environmental studies, political economy, and Catholic social teaching, as well as anti-colonial feminist work, which is what I do and where I feel most at home. Um, Talking about what wasn't said and what more needs to be said from this very particular positionality. So that has been a lot of fun to write. And as it turns out, Pope Francis is set to release an update to Laudato Si on October 4th. This was just announced a few weeks ago. So that will not be an encyclical, but it will be a follow up in the form of an apostolic exhortation. And I am going to make bingo boards with what I think will be in that update, both rhetorically and conceptually. So if you and other listeners want to play, you just let me know and I'll send out these bingo boards once I design them. And then as you read it, I don't know. I haven't gotten to the actual like how we play bingo or who wins what.
Right.
It's more just having fun with reality. Um, okay, so the bingo is actually not the point. The book is the point, but it's exciting that that this update is coming out, and so a part of the book will, of course, be engaging that, and that will run throughout. I've been working for a lot of years now on the concept of the Anthropocene between scientific discourse and the ways it functions as a regulative ideology, and I argue a secular theology in its own right, or certainly a secular theological anthropology in the geological sciences, especially, and by this particular group of exhortatory scientists who are really committed to it. And then looking at how the concept is being deployed in ecotheology and religious studies and religion and ecology. And so that book project, I just finished a 3-year grant with the John Templeton Foundation and a cadre of fantastic science engaged professors in the humanities, especially theology. And so that book project will be what comes out of that. And as part of that, I'm starting a partnership on a planetary metaphysics project at the Berggruen Institute in LA. So I don't know how long that will be for, but it will be, I think, generative and pretty cool. And then the third thing, which is intended more for a general audience, is a book in a series the series is being developed by Cynthia Molabita, who's at the Graduate Theological Union, Pacific Lutheran School of Theology, and she's done amazing work on equitable economies. And her 2014 book, I think it's 2014, maybe 2012, is called Resisting Structural Evil, and talking about this dynamic that you and I were discussing about individuals within systems that have certain predilections. So there will be 6 books in this series with Fortress Press, and I'm writing the one on a moral economy of water, equitable and ecological formations. So, and I also have an amazing teenager who, last but not least, teaches me all the time about how certain members of her generation, at least in New York, Westchester County, are regarding the environment and our politicians and many other things. And the things that, like, again, as a scholar, the opportunity to learn from so many different kinds of people is a gift. And I learn and am kept humble every day by the teenagers. So, Mom, not the Anthropocene again.
Oh, that's
But
great.
or Charles Darwin. I'll tell her anecdotes about Charles Darwin because I also teach a class called Human Nature After Darwin, and it's like in the bioethics minor and so forth. And so she, constantly rolling her eyes. And yet in her biology class last semester, someone brought up Charles Darwin, the teacher did, and natural selection, and said, "Does anyone know anything about this?" And lo and behold, guess who did?
She's like, yeah, I know too much about it.
Yeah, oh my gosh, talk to my mom. No, it was cute. She was
Uh,
actually like secretly proud in that way you can tell when you're a parent.
that's really sweet. That's very sweet. Wow, that's a lot. You're right about juggling. That's quite a lot. Um,
Yeah.
I'm definitely interested in playing that bingo game. So
Okay.
yeah, we'll have to get those cards out, and maybe might figure out a way to link it to the show notes for this episode too, so anybody listening can like download the
Ooh.
bingo card. Because I'm very curious. I have no idea what's going to be in that update, but yeah, I'm very excited about it. And especially I'm at a Catholic university and Jesuit in particular, and so they're very concerned with trying to enact Laudato Si and don't
Hmm.
necessarily know exactly what to do about it. And so,
Yep.
there's a whole committee and we're working on it. And I think there still is this need to really flesh out the full implications of it. And a lot of things he kind of tiptoes around. Like one of the things I always complain about is they mentions cry the earth, cry the poor, but somehow doesn't cite Leonardo Boff.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah, I'm
Right.
just constantly frustrated by that. And so people
I
still
mean, you
think integral
blogged about
ecology.
this in 2015 when it came out. You made that point on your blog, I think.
Yeah,
And you were like, WTAF.
yeah,
I mean, you didn't say that. You were more
and
polite. But
maybe.
but no, and you know what's fascinating is that Amitav Ghosh, author of The Great Derangement, literary theorist and novelist, um, The Great Derangement, which came out, I think, 2016, maybe, with University of Chicago Press. He's a big fan of Laudato Si in that document, in that book, rather. And then, fine. And then his more recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse, that just came out a year and a half or so ago, he also is a big fan of Laudato Si, and he invokes it at one point. And the line that he invokes as being possibly the most true thing written in modernity, I paraphrase, but it's laudatory, um, is that line where Pope Francis is talking about we must listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. But Pope Francis didn't cite it, and now Ghosh doesn't cite it. And so back to the problem of citation, with which we, touched on earlier. It's real. So yeah, it's a huge part of one of my chapters in the book. Okay. I hear you, and I'm a fan of your insight, is what I'm trying to say. Um, but I think maybe for a future conversation, I also am at a Jesuit university in New York City, and we too are very much trying to figure out what implementation looks like within the particular constraints and possibilities of an educational institution. And one of the things that most excites me is potential partnerships with physical plant and envisioning what it might mean for universities, and especially residential ones, as Fordham is in some ways, to envision when they build new buildings, for example, to be a proof of concept about water recycling, not just water reuse. So like Santa Clara, awesome. Santa Clara uses reused water from their dorms on their lawns. That's great. But what would it mean to actually implement a water recycling system, like in Singapore, for example, other places, where, say, in the dorms, water that's used in the washing machines is then reverse osmosis purified in all the processes and then used for drinking water, shower water, all that stuff. What if it were a totally enclosed system? And what if universities could be the proof of concept for that? How cool would that be?
That would be very cool. I will mention that, and we'll try see if I can get my university to do that. I'd imagine they're like, nice, that's cute, Sam. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I'm not saying this is on the plan at Fordham, but I do bring these things up anytime.
Yeah.
I also want at graduation to have an ice sculpture of Pope Francis that has an audio of him giving quotes about fresh water from Laudato Si. So far, you'll be shocked to hear that so far the folks who organized commencement have not seen the power of my vision. But
I
like,
don't
right,
know.
we got to be able to have fun with this stuff
Yeah,
too.
that's true. Have
Um,
fun and aim high. I think we can
yeah,
do both of those things.
I like that.
Yeah. Well, geez. Well, this was a lot of fun, and I could chat with you for much longer, but I think around an hour is a good limit for podcast. We'll have to have you back on, though. You have a lot of other things going on, but especially it might be fun to chat with you after the update to Laudato Si comes out. We can check in about the bingo game and see what's in that document and where we need to push it further.
Sam, I would absolutely love that. Let's do it.
Cool. All right. Well, that's the plan.
Okay,
Uh,
awesome.
well,
It's great
geez,
to see you.
this was such a treat. Thanks so much for making time for us, and especially during the beginning of the semester. I always feel bad even talking to other professors at the beginning of the semester. I'm like, I'll talk to you in November or something, because it's a little chaotic. So yeah, really appreciate it, and looking forward to doing it again soon.
All right, likewise. Have a wonderful day. And thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, the listeners, the watchers, and we'll be back with more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.